So I want everyone to start by looking at this picture. What do you see? You might see a younger woman sort of looking over her shoulder. You might see the side profile of an older woman. If you've seen this before, you might actually be able to change how you're looking at it to see both. Or maybe you can only see one. Well, this whole image is the same for everyone, right? All the lines are the exact same, but the way we perceive it is different. Our reality is different based on our perception. And this is due to a hidden algorithm, if you will, in our heads. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There are two processes that govern this algorithm. The first is sensation, how your body interprets and makes sense of sensory information around you. This is known as bottom-up processing, this raw sensory information being processed by your sensory organs, things like your eyes, your skin, your mouth, etc. The other process is this perception, your conscious experience of the sensory information around you. And this is called top-down processing. Top-down processing is essentially your brain's best guess or hypothesis about what's going on in the world. Now let's break it down a little more. First, we have this bottom-up processing. If we're thinking about a computer, this might look like binary code. You have all these ones and zeros that might not mean anything inherently, but it's that flow of information into the computer system. Of course, we are not computers, we are people. And like I said earlier, this is that sensory information. For example, the light entering your eye and the way your eye makes sense of this to be able to see different lines, edges, and colors, for example. Now, if we waited for all this information to come in from each of our sensory modalities, this would take a long time. And that's where top-down processing comes in handy. Like I said earlier, it's your brain's prediction. When you have all this sensory information coming into you, your brain checks it against previous experiences. Where have you seen this before? What happened last time? And these sorts of expectations about what happened will your brain will predict how this situation will go this time. We can break that down into a nice simple formula. Our top-down processing is our expectations based on what happened last time. For that, we of course also need our memory, and that will give us our brain's best guess about what's happening. Now, how does our brain do this all so quickly? Well, it relies on something called Gestalt principles, and these are basically principles or codes, if you will, that help your brain process information faster. So you can see in the image with all the circles, we might split these into two groups. The two circles on the right, you might consider one group. The line of circles on the left, you might consider another. This is the principle of proximity, right? Our brains tend to group things in groups based on how close they are to each other. On the right, we have an image with squares and hexagons, and we might group these based on shape. We might count all the squares in a group and all the hexagons in a group. This is the principle of similarity. Our brains group together similar objects. But the clearest way we can see this is with the principle of closure. So in this image, we might be able to see a cube. But what if I told you there are no lines actually connecting the sides of the cube? What if the circles are just split in a way that maybe your brain, based on previous expectations and patterns, might predict that maybe there is a hidden shape here, when in reality, it is just empty space. Now, of course, this way of looking at things, these predictions, don't just apply to visual stimuli, they apply to absolutely everything in our lives. And we can call this our perceptual set, so our expectations about how the world is meant to be. For example, if I showed you this image of kind of messy visual information, our brain can view this through its filter, through our top-down processing. And through this filter, we might make sense of all this jumbled information and conclude that it's a dog. But wait, we all have different expectations and experiences, right? Well, similarly, we each have our own filters. So if you lived maybe a slightly different life than I have, you might make sense of the same image, but be more geared towards anticipating it as a wolf rather than a domesticated dog. Now, we can also apply this to our social biases. How many times have you looked at someone for the first time and made snap judgments about their character? If I showed you an image of a superhero, despite you never having seen them before, and asked you to describe them, you might say that they're brave, strong, have a strong sense of justice, and they're determined. Likewise, if I showed you a photo of a woman with a child, you might conclude that she's a mother and therefore describe her as caring, loving, beautiful, and supportive, right? We can see that these past expectations of what a superhero is or how a mother should be and should act influence our immediate first impression of that person. These first impressions are based off of extremely limited information, yet they're all governed by how our brains view this information through our filters. Now, what have we learned? Well, we learned that all of this raw sensory data coming in is up to interpretation, and how we interpret it differs based on person to person. Now, of course, we can't turn off this perceptual set, we can't turn off this filter, but what can we do instead? Well, if you notice yourself making these snap judgments, maybe these harsh criticisms or expectations of how a person should act, I urge you to take a step back and ask yourself, are you truly seeing the whole picture of what's there, or are you just looking for what you expect to see? Thank you.